Dan, I've known for many years. He's been involved in government and energy policy and environmental policy for a long, long time, including on the 2008 presidential transition team. And while he didn't join the administration, has taken a role in Connecticut as commissioner of the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection there. He has been a friend of the Energy Center from our very first days, including joining us at the dinner to celebrate our launch this past April. He's hired great staff, including some of my former colleagues from the White House, and probably is our most famous guest since you've appeared on the Colbert Report twice, I think. That's pretty impressive. And what we're here to talk about today is how to finance investment in clean energy and the challenges that we face both at the federal level and especially at the state level, since we have people from New York and Connecticut here who are really leading in that effort today. There's been a lot of talk about what Richard's trying to do with Green Bank development in New York State, and I hope he'll talk about that when he gets here. But Dan's really been a visionary leader in these, in a number of these respects in the state of Connecticut. So I don't want to describe what he's done because I want to give him the chance to do that, but there really is a lot to learn from that model. So please join me in welcoming to Columbia Dan Esty.
Jason, thank you very much. It really is a great pleasure to be here. And my co-speaker, Richard, is about to enter the room, so I'll filibuster for 10 more seconds so that he doesn't have to miss all the important points I'm making. Jason did mention that I was on the Colbert Report not once but twice. That is a certain degree of ignominy, I'm afraid. But I'm going to give you the key to success so that when you're invited to go on the Colbert Report, you will not be nervous. But otherwise, you should be nervous, because I'd have to say it's the most difficult interview I've ever done, having done thousands. But as you all know, Colbert does not have a linear thought pattern, and so it's very hard to understand where the next question is coming from based on the current question. But if you are ever invited to go on, number one, don't try to be funny. He's the funny one. Number two, don't accept the premise of his questions if they're insane. So he did ask me, in fact, whether we were in the future going to have to run our cars on walrus blubber. But I think that was an invitation not to debate the merits of walrus blubber, but rather to transition to other alternative energy sources. And then three, the most important point is have three things you want to say and say them no matter what. Find a way to make your points. In that regard, my point today is to say that I believe we are in need of a different approach to energy policy in the 21st century from what we have done in the 20th century. Point one. Point two, it requires a changed frame of thought around what the government role is. And I'm going to go into that in some detail. But we live in an era of limited government capacity, limited government budgets, and I think that requires a changed appreciation, understanding of what the right role for government is. And number three, lots of talk around innovation being the key to success, and I agree. But I want to argue that it's not just innovation in technology, but innovation in a wide range of arenas. So innovation in the policy arena, in the incentives we put forward, innovation in how we do outreach to people and to businesses, how we market, and fundamentally and most importantly, innovation in finance, how we finance clean energy. And that, I think, is really the story of today. We in Connecticut have set up a green bank and done a number of other things to make both renewable power and energy efficiency more affordable for everyday citizens and for businesses. And I think now we are seeing a trend in this direction. Richard Kauffman has launched in New York a similar commitment to a green bank and to creative energy finance. And I think the real opportunity for us today is to spend a few minutes laying out our visions, but then really having a dialogue back and forth and with all of you on this changed opportunity that I see emerging around how we do energy for the 21st century. And let me start by saying I don't think we had a very good 20th century. You know, the wires in the streets, the poles, the electricity, same strategy we had in 1913 that we have in 2013. Power generation, virtually the same. Our vehicles, virtually the same. In fact, we had more electric vehicles on the streets in 1900 than we did in 2000. So in some ways, we've gone backwards over 100 years. So I'm going to make a strong case that energy did not move forward very fast or very well in the 20th century. We need to do better in the 21st. In Connecticut, Governor Dan Malloy is, in my mind, an extraordinary visionary when it comes to policy. Really the most amazing policy analyst I've ever seen in elected office. And he took office and made a bold first step in the energy arena, which was to create a Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. Previously, we had a Department of Environmental Protection, and energy was scattered across various elements of state government. He understood that we needed to integrate energy and environment. We needed to do energy in a systematic way. And so I am now, as you heard from Jason, a commissioner of a Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, DEEP. And I like to joke, just to drive this point home, that I spell that acronym DEEP with 3 E's: energy, the environment, and the economy. Because the key to success really is integrating energy, environment, and economic growth requirements, competitiveness, job needs into a unified policy framework. So Governor Malloy has pushed to really make energy a key part of state government. And this, too, is new. For many, many decades, I think for most of the 20th century and into the 21st century, people have assumed that energy was a federal policy domain. But all of you know, and it's somewhat ironic I might say this, some of you may know I have a wife who's in the Congress. But I would say the federal government is making little progress on energy at a time when urgent progress is required, not only on energy, but related environmental issues like climate change. So I think by force of the structure of the United States government and our layers of government and federalism, we've seen a default of action now flowing to the states. But that's new and it's important. So Governor Malloy started out by saying to me, we need a comprehensive energy strategy, something Connecticut's never had. So let me just give you the 5 quick top-line bullets, and then I want to shift into what it means. First of all, we need, and I think it's true of every state, and frankly of every country, we need to make sure that we're doing everything we can with regard to energy efficiency. Some people call efficiency the first fuel. It is the best option to the extent cost-effective, because energy you don't consume is energy that is much more affordable and much less damaging to the environment. So energy efficiency optimization is our #1 goal and strategy across all sectors. So not just houses, but all residences, houses, apartments, condos, senior living centers, across what sometimes is known as the MUSH marketplace, municipalities, universities, schools, hospitals, all public buildings, and then, of course, the commercial industrial sector. Now, what it turns out is critical is we know how to do energy efficiency. We've done it for a long time. It's how do you move from what I call light energy efficiency, literally changing out the light bulbs, perhaps doing a little weather stripping, to deep energy efficiency, which is around the whole systems of a building: heating, lighting, air conditioning, ventilation, insulation in the roof, new windows, better doors, replacing the furnace, the boiler, everything including the Coke machine that consumes energy. We're now talking at a household level of not a few $100s of investment, but thousands. So the key here is not innovation in technology, it's innovation in finance. And what we've done in Connecticut is to make energy efficiency loans available with no money down and in a way that ensures in most cases the savings in your monthly energy bill will be greater than the amount required to repay your loan. So cash flow positive from day one. Innovation in finance. Second big element of our strategy is electricity supply. We need in the 21st century more diverse sources of energy. So we're working on diversifying our electricity generation base. In Connecticut, we're about half nuclear, almost half natural gas. We need to do more to draw in hydropower from Canada and, very importantly, to ramp up our renewables. And so we have done that again with some creative policy tools, ramping up our in-state small-scale renewable power, wind turbines, but largely solar, by tenfold since the time Governor Malloy took office in 2010. And we've done it with a couple of important policy interventions. First, we don't believe in Connecticut in having special programs for wind or solar or geothermal. We believe in making the different techniques and technologies compete. Second, we believe that there should be competition. So we don't accept the prevailing model in much of the world for financing renewable power, particularly the feed-in tariff approach, which sets a certain price, and often too high a price, and then has various project developers compete to be selected by governments. We think that ends up almost always with less diversity of supply, less diversity of project opportunity, and much higher prices. In fact, it was those very high prices that caused Governor Chris Christie across the river to abandon New Jersey's at one time leading renewable energy program because he was paying 60 cents a kilowatt hour for power. That was when the prevailing price was around 10 cents a kilowatt hour, maybe 14, 12, depending on where you were. So when I took office, Governor Malloy said to me, Dan, don't ever bring me 60-cent power. In fact, don't bring me 30-cent per kilowatt hour power. He said the day you do that is your last day on the job. So that was kind of a chastening thought. But what we have done is to use reverse auctions to drive down the price. At the local, in-state scale, and we brought down the price from 40 cents a kilowatt hour, which is what Connecticut was paying in 2010, to now we're going to announce next week the latest round of these projects under 20 cents a kilowatt hour fully loaded. At the grid scale, same principle. Competition is what matters. All technologies competing. Use the forces of the marketplace, harness competition to drive down costs, because the core of the Malloy strategy is not for clean energy. In fact, if you were asked, do you favor clean energy, you would say no. It is cheaper, cleaner, and more reliable electricity, and more broadly energy that we're after. So this use of competition to drive down costs is very, very important. We just concluded a procurement at grid scale, 270 megawatts of power, big wind project in Maine, a huge solar project, one of the largest in the East Coast in Connecticut, at an average price out over 15 and 20-year contracts of under 8 cents a kilowatt hour. That is virtually grid parity. And that is transformative. The amount of popular support you get for renewable energy, if you're bringing in the cost at 8 or 7.9 or 7.8 cents a kilowatt hour when the prevailing price is 7.6 cents a kilowatt hour, is huge. Dramatically different than if you're paying 30 or 40 cents a kilowatt hour. So cheaper clean energy is really the key to a sustainable energy future. That is the core of the 21st century model of energy that I think is now coming to the fore. And again, what was the key to success in getting those prices down? Competition, but more importantly, contracts. People have had renewable portfolio standards for decades. Connecticut's had one for 15 years, ratcheting up slowly our commitment to renewable power, headed for a 20% commitment by 2020. 15 years of that RPS in place. How many grid-scale wind projects have been developed as a result? 0. How many grid-scale solar projects had been developed? 0. So the prevailing wisdom of the 20th century, that if you command that there should be 20% renewable power by 2020, not happening. Command and control does not work in the energy domain. You need to figure out how to get the projects to happen on the ground. And that requires a different approach. It requires power purchase agreements. It requires contracts. It requires something that is bankable when a project director goes in to get financing. The promise that someday Connecticut might have 20% of its power from renewables does not get your banker to lend you a couple of $100 million to build a wind farm. The fact you walk in with a contract that says the state of Connecticut will buy your power for 15 or 20 years is financeable. You can get $200 million loaned to you on that basis. We also know we need to do more in the way of infrastructure in Connecticut. So you'll hear more about that in the coming weeks. We need new transmission lines. We need new gas pipelines, natural gas pipelines, because the third element of our strategy is expanded access to natural gas, which we believe is the cheapest, cleanest, most reliable base source of energy for the next decade or two in the United States. So we want to make sure more of Connecticut's citizens have access. We have an agenda in transportation focused on clean fuels and clean vehicles, building out an infrastructure again to provide consumer choice. We want to make sure that if folks decide they'd like to try an electric vehicle, they are not held back by fear of range anxiety, the prospect of running out of power. So we are building out a base structure of electric vehicle charging stations that will be publicly available. And by the first quarter of the new year, we will end range anxiety in the state of Connecticut. Now, admittedly, we're a small state. Take a lot more to do this in Texas or California. But nevertheless, that's a big step forward. Final element of the strategy is reliability. And we are absolutely committed to ensuring that the kind of trauma and drama that occurred after Storm Sandy in New York and New Jersey, less so in Connecticut, but after Storm Irene in Connecticut and several other big weather events, should not ever recur, which is people out of power for not just days, but weeks, and huge amount of human suffering because we couldn't get fuel to people, couldn't get power on. So we in Connecticut are doing a lot in that regard, trying to make a smarter grid, more sensors to find outages. That'll be critical as well to helping us trim peak load demand out in the future. We're also trimming trees, bringing in new utility poles, new wires, but fundamentally picking another element for resiliency, which is the development of a network of microgrids. So we know that there will be future outages. There will be future hurricanes, snowstorms, ice storms. This is life in the north. But we do not have to have people suffer in the future as they have in the past. So we've already launched 9 pilot projects and are going to fund 10 or 15 more in the coming year, which are around a network of distributed generation, small-scale power generation opportunities that are, and this is the critical point, not just backup power, but 24/7 power provision, but islandable during an outage when the grid is down, separatable from the grid and therefore able to stay up when the grid is down. And our goal is to provide those power sources, those distributed generation microgrids for critical elements of public safety, police and fire stations, hospitals, sewage treatment plants, but also for critical commercial services. So in some number of downtowns scattered across the state, we will keep up and running a grocery store, a gas station, a bank, and a pharmacy. Because if you can get food and water and your medicines, fill up your car with gas, get money, life can go on, even if your home has not got electricity for some number of days. So the key here, again, is in many cases not dramatic transformation in technology, but rather dramatic transformation in the access to technology, in the scaling of the deployment of clean energy. And that's what we're really after. We want, as I said, to drive innovation. We want to spur innovation in technologies. We've set up an advanced energy innovation hub that we're going to try to spur new technology development, but we're equally committed to innovation in policy, in incentives, in engagement of the public, in marketing, and as I said, most importantly, in finance. And we have set up, as a result, the first in the nation green bank, our Clean Energy Finance and Investment Authority. The goal there is to use limited government money, and inevitably in the 21st century, government budgets are tight. Use limited government money to leverage private capital. We're doing this in a number of ways. We've also set up a statewide commercial PACE program, property assessed clean energy. And that is a way to have businesses in particular get access to very low cost capital to do clean energy projects. And the lower the cost of the capital, the more of them that want to do it. How do we keep the cost of capital down? By making repayment go with your property tax bill. It's a very simple mechanism, but property taxes are almost always paid. It therefore de-risks these investments from the point of view of the private capital flowing in. They require less of a risk premium. Lower cost of capital means better projects, cheaper projects, higher paybacks, more companies willing to step up. In the residential marketplace, we're doing something similar with on-bill repayment of clean energy loans. Again, that helps to secure the loan, reduces the cost of capital, reduces default, makes more projects happen. Our green bank at this point is deploying somewhere in the neighborhood of $50 million a year. About half of it is in loans that will be repaid, we hope. It looks pretty solid now. Half of it is in our use of money to de-risk projects. So we take a first tranche of loan losses in some cases. We buy down interest rates in other cases. We have a variety of incentives designed to make it attractive for private capital to come in and do the bulk of the work. And we're getting leverage of between 5 private dollars for every dollar we invest and 10. So really dramatic leverage. There are a couple of other things I think are key to success here in terms of the finance opportunity. One is to be able to have government entities like our green banks bundle projects and then have money center financiers come in and buy the bundle. And in doing so, we need to systematize and normalize the structure of these deals. It can't be that each one is analyzed. They have to be looked at as a package and understood as fitting certain categories. The other thing we're trying to do is to drive scale, and that again makes these more attractive, lowers the cost of capital, de-risks the project portfolio as a whole. We're also looking to take down the soft costs of doing clean energy projects. In particular, the regulatory costs, the building permits, the inspections, the approvals, the certifications. Lowers cost again, makes it more attractive, lowers the cost of the project, makes them more higher payback. We're looking at other ways to de-risk. Again, power purchase agreements have a contract behind them. The structure of that contract matters. We're trying to make sure it is attractive from the point of view of project developers. We're using insurance. Again, a lot of these new technologies people are shaky about, so they want a risk premium. So we're actually bringing insurance in behind things like our fuel cell build-out. Very interesting to see insurance products backing up those fuel cells that are going into action. We also are looking at trying to make sure there's clarity in information, which also helps support the flow of finance. And doing things like having standardized performance contracts for energy efficiency, making it easier for municipalities or businesses to engage an energy services company. Now, ESCOs are out in the marketplace every day. A town manager probably goes out in the marketplace once in a career to engage an energy efficiency contract. He's nervous he's going to get a bad deal. Standardized contracts reduces that risk. Again, makes it easier for him to do the project. So again, the bottom line here is I think we are on the verge of a transformed energy future. An energy future that, again, has a central focus on innovation, change technology, but even more than people have appreciated, transformation in these other dimensions, including, most importantly, finance. So thank you very much for giving me a chance to open the conversation. I look forward to a robust dialogue after we've heard from Richard Kauffman about what's being done in parallel in the state of New York. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dan. That was a great overview. I really appreciate it. And it's really a treat and a privilege to have Richard Kauffman here. Richard and I were colleagues in the Obama administration, where he served as senior advisor to Secretary Chu at the Energy Department, with a strong focus on how to increase deployment of clean energy throughout the economy and deploy clean energy finance, among numerous other priorities that he was responsible for, and then joined the administration of Governor Cuomo earlier this year, I think in February, as chairman of Energy and Finance for New York. But I think people call you the Energy Czar. Is that right? That's an informal title. And has a long and distinguished history in the private sector for work in energy and finance as the CEO of Good Energies, as a partner at Goldman Sachs, and in many other respects. So when we're talking about increasing finance for clean energy, this is someone who's done it in the real world, as well as think long and hard about what the right role for government is to help make that happen. And so I hope we can learn a little bit about that today, and then we'll have a discussion with us, and also Travis Bradford, who runs the energy and environment concentration here, is going to help with that as well, given that so much of his scholarship focuses on that. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Jason, and congratulations to you for everything you've done so far. I like the new logo and everything. It's really great. And Dan sort of, I'm a little older than Dan. He's kind of my big brother, even though he has a small state. That really is set the pace in a lot of things. So just quickly, just say a few things. Having worked at the federal government, when you work at the federal government, you think that the states, we should tell them what to do. But I have to say, now that I'm working at the states, I want the federal government off my back. So one of the reasons why I left Washington is that obviously it's hard to get stuff done. And so when we think about trying to make a transition to a clean energy economy, the real action is at the state level. The projects are at the state level, building codes are at the state level, and most of the relevant electricity regulation is also at the state level. And I have to say that green energy, clean energy, is not a partisan issue at most states as well. And so I've told the story to some of you already, but I was with the head of the Kansas Public Utilities Commission a few weeks ago, and I'm sure we disagree on a number of things. We didn't talk about climate change, but we had lots to talk about in terms of clean energy, because He views wind as an export, just like agricultural exports to the state. We talked about energy efficiency. He said, boy, we really care a lot about energy efficiency. The thing that kills small towns is the grocery store packs up and leaves. And if we can have programs to help energy efficiency in grocery stores, it holds the towns together. So I want to just make some observations about New York, and I also have to give a Miranda warning that what I'm going to talk about here is not policy. There are some things that we're thinking about. So I'd say that New York has what would be considered a progressive set of policies in the electric sector. We have deregulated markets, which means generation can't be owned by distribution utilities. So in theory, you have the benefit of competition and market forces that should lower price for consumers. We have decoupling, so the distribution utilities are not incented for the quantum of electrons that are sold. And we have a pretty good RPS and not only renewable portfolio standards, but we also have an EAPS program as well, energy efficiency programs as well. So that's all pretty good. But what have we wrought by these policies? Well, the first is that we have very expensive electricity in the state of New York, amongst the most expensive in the country. No one is worried about your bill unless the customer can have a relationship with an ESCO. Nobody's worrying about your bill in the system because power costs are passed through to consumers. Decoupling, well, it doesn't create incentives for utilities to sell electrons. It doesn't create real incentives for utilities to save. And it creates real equity issues because as more and more customers decide they want to take on their own solutions or do energy efficiency, what happens is that the remaining fixed costs get spread over fewer and fewer customers. It's not a big problem now, but when you think about what's happened to the wireline business and telephony, you can see the future, and the future is fewer and fewer people paying more and more for less and less. The other point is that there are limits to RPS, and we support RPS, and so I just want to put this in context of limits. I mean, it is a fee on ratepayers. I mean, so it always sounds good, but people are paying for it because it's an extra charge on the bill. And so if you already have high electricity costs, you have to be mindful of there are just limits of how much more you can charge. What do we do with the money that we collect? Well, we use it in the form of giving subsidies or support to renewable energy and to energy efficiency programs. I'm just going to just point out that, say, when with residential energy efficiency programs in the state, 70% of the houses in New York State are more than 70 years old. And so, boy, that ought to be ample ground for energy efficiency. The state will pay for audit for your house, pay some grants, up to 20% to do a retrofit in your house. And at the current rate of penetration of these programs, it's going to take 550 years to retrofit the housing stock in New York. So it's a question about how effective these programs are per dollar spent. And the other point on RPS, and Dan touched on this when we talked about soft costs, it's very hard even for a state as large as New York to influence hardware costs. And so a lot of the dollars that are going to support renewable energy really go to support of hardware costs because we're funding projects. And so the question is, again, lots of states can do to support soft costs, but right now a lot of the dollars are going to hardware costs. So we really can't keep going along like this indefinitely because we have an infrastructure that is old in New York, needs to be replaced. It's expensive. We already have expensive electricity. Haven't talked about resiliency, but that's another additional cost. We need to accelerate the change to clean economy. I mean, it's just it's an imperative. So we have to go faster. The costs of distributed generation is declining. So this, and it's not just solar, it's also fuel cells and storage and everything else, and that putting pressure on arguably different parts of the utility business model. And the other point is that we're not really taking advantage of all the technology that currently exists that could provide more value to customers. And so the irony about the electric utility, electricity, and I've said this last week or when I was here, is that Edison always thought it was just about lighting, and he never could have imagined what we use all this electricity for. We're kind of at that same point now with the ability of what this new electric system could provide to us if we used all the technology that is available, but we're not adequately adopting it. So I think just to give you some outlines of some of the things we're thinking about. So the first is that there's a lot of uncertainty. I mean, natural gas, and I'm not going to talk about fracking, is a game changer. Jason's talked about this. So there's a lot of uncertainty as far as that. There's uncertainty in terms of other kinds of technology. So the state, we can't predict or dictate the future. I think what we want to try to get right are market signals and regulatory incentives, or at least change regulatory disincentives, and then try to let market forces work as well as they can. And we need to engage market forces if we're going to move more rapidly and more effectively and more efficiently per ratepayer dollar expended. So let me just talk a little bit about some market issues. The first, unfortunately, I said, I wanted the federal government to get off, I don't want to be quoted on any of this. What the president meant to say, by the way, about being a czar, it didn't work out so well for the czars. So, but when we talk about, we have to, one of the market issues is wholesale markets. So wholesale markets are governed by FERC, and wholesale markets really have some flaws. One flaw is that we have capacity markets, and if you look at capacity prices, they move quite a lot, and capacity markets are supposed to signal long-term capital commitments. But if you have short-term price movements, it's very hard to generate long-term capital commitments. So that's a problem. And so I'm not convinced that capacity markets really work very well. But with respect to clean energy, it doesn't really work very well in New York State. We can't really tell very well about what distributed resources are or what energy efficiency resources are in terms of how wholesale markets work. The other thing is that the wholesale markets assume a world, a kind of one-way world, where demand is fixed and we determine what supply is going to be, a day ahead. It's not a two-way market. If you think about the fact that technology exists to have supply react to demand signals, that's not really part of the market. Really, there's been some experimentation at the margin at FERC, but it's not. FERC still assumes a demarcation between wholesale and retail markets that really needs to be thought through. And we can't do all of that on our own. We have to have the engagement of FERC. But it's a major issue in structural markets. So let's talk about this distribution utilities. That is in the realm of the state, so we can think about Con Ed. So distribution utilities, a lot to say, but I'm just going to pick one point, which is that I guess across the street and so forth is the business school. The business school, probably for the last 30 years, the whole emphasis on private equity and so forth, and your friends that are earning 2 and 20 doing private equity, it's all about capital efficiency. Except the electric utility industry is still compensated based upon how much capital is in the ground, based really as a vestige of concerns about universal access. So the average capacity utilization of the system is about 55%. Con Ed's is about, again, between 50 and 55%, which means it's built for the hottest hours of the year. The rest of the time, all that capital throughout the whole system is idle. And so we are burdened with that from a ratepayer standpoint. But in addition, it's not only financially inefficient, it's energy inefficient as well. And the reason why that's the case is because that's how we regulate and compensate the electric utility industry. Dan talked about innovation. I talked about the need to draw in innovation around customers. We can do all the great things in the world in terms of getting price signals and regulatory incentives right, but we've got to get more innovation around customers to engage customers in terms of what this new energy system might be, and not all customers are going to be the same. But so we need to have a more competitive environment around customers. In theory, there's customer choice in New York. You can pick your electricity provider, but it's not really, it's not really a choice because you don't really know what else is out there. And so we need to really work on that. And, you can imagine that you could get more value for your electric system. You could save money because it could be more energy efficient. You could be more independent. You get more reliability. You could have better power quality. Power quality is a real issue, which we could talk about. There could be a whole range of ancillary services that we, haven't thought about. Somebody could tell you to change your filter in your air conditioner. They could tell you that you could put in a new air conditioner and your kids wouldn't get asthma, and you could get paid. The new air conditioning could be paid for the savings. You could have an app on your phone to tell you that you could get paid by turning off certain appliances at certain times of the day. Who knows? But the only way that's going to happen is by drawing in more innovation and more competition around customers. And the last point really is also a theme that Dan talked about, which is more leverage on ratepayer funds. So we collect these funds. If we're going to worry about the bill and want to try to create incentives for different people to worry about customer bills, we have to be mindful that the state, through its policies, is taking money from customers, and it's our obligation to get as much leverage on that money as we can. And so the way we're going to do that is to use ratepayer funds as much as we can as a bridge to markets. And so the Green Bank, our Green Bank, following Little Big Brother, Connecticut, we are calling it a Green Bank though, it really is designed to do things very similar to what Dan talked about in terms of being in the credit enhancement business, to be in areas of the market where there are financing gaps, to not be in the subsidy business. The financing gaps arise because there are bank capital rules that make it difficult for banks to lend to smaller projects, energy efficiency and renewable energy projects. It's not about being anti-clean energy. It's about bank capital rules, and it happens to be in the whatever the opposite of a sweet spot is. It happens to disproportionately, the new capital rules disproportionately harm the financing availability of clean energy. And then there's also very limited use of capital markets. So if you have those two constraints, there are meaningful gaps in the clean energy financing market. And it's not about the cost of financing, it's about the availability of financing. And that's what gives rise to the ability to get leverage, because you can charge a kind of market rate of return for your credit enhancement, and you're leveraging private sector capital, as Dan suggests, because a lender is coming in and lending to a project. And then if it is indeed a commercial opportunity, over time the bank can step out and the commercial markets can go on their way, as opposed to subsidy where you pay it and it's gone forever. So another example of something that we've been talking to our colleagues at NYPA about, and Lloyd Cass is here from NYPA, and so this is just an idea, but just to give you a flavor. So right now NYPA has the ability to work with any municipality in the state and for renewable energy or distributed generation project, schools, towns. So to Dan's point, there's a community that may be interested in a microgrid or doing something fuel cell at a town hall. So that's something that NYPA can do the project, can do the financing for it. But now imagine that we could take ratepayer funds from NYSERDA and use the event to get the rest of the community organized. And One of the things that Connecticut has done very effectively is solarize. The getting communities involved does two things. It lowers the customer acquisition costs. It also creates a kind of, community peer pressure. And so that might be the combination of those things. We may be able to get much more leverage on our ratepayer dollars by getting communities involved as opposed to whether in energy efficiency or in renewable energy incentives by trying to lower customer acquisition costs and creating scale than by merely providing support to projects. So why didn't I stop there? Thanks very much.
Thanks so much. Let me take a seat here. Let me ask one or two questions, and then I want to ask Professor Bradford to really take the lead because he spent so much time thinking about these things, and ask a couple of questions, and then open it up to all of you. Also, those who are watching online can ask questions via on Twitter via the hashtag CGEP events. That's CGEP events, which is not easy to say, but it makes sense if you think about it. So let me ask. If both of you, because you've had experience implementing or thinking about design of a green bank, could just say a little bit more about the market failure it's trying to solve and why finance is not flowing to clean energy. You talked about that a little bit, Richard. So one, obviously, is we don't have policy in place that has internalized the social costs. We don't have a carbon price, so it's not a level playing field. So take that aside and then help us understand what's different about clean energy that, as you said, makes it harder to, the size is different. These are smaller projects. There's limited support. There's lots of uncertainty in markets. We have pretty liquid capital markets. People in this town, where we are in particular, are pretty good at figuring out if there's money to be made, how to get capital to projects, be they small oil and gas projects, in a shale site in Colorado or some other piece of the energy system. Is it about size? Is it about what's different about clean energy that makes it harder, leaving the level playing field and assuming we had a carbon price in place, that makes it harder to attract finance? And so how does government policy address those barriers?
So let me just pick off a couple of points, and I'm sure Richard will have a few more. Despite the fact that clean energy has been talked about for a long time, decades, it's still perceived as new to many in the capital markets. And as a result, I think there is, whenever something is new, nervousness about it. There's a sense of uncertainty, and uncertainty translates into risk. Risk translates into the need for a higher rate of capital, a risk premium. So I think one of the things we are trying to do is to de-risk these projects so that the capital flows will be easier and the rates of return can be brought down, and therefore more projects can be benefit cost positive. So I think that's one piece. Another piece I would say, and Richard covered this in a number of ways, but I think we should really drive the nail in home, and that is that there is an entrenched status quo in particularly the electricity marketplace. Even though we have, in a number of states, New York and Connecticut, deregulated in the last decade, we still have utilities that I think are shockingly non-entrepreneurial and quite risk-averse and quite nervous about the changing business models that Richard and I are talking about. So we have lots of efforts on the part of utilities to preserve and protect their status quo. In the form of franchise rights, so that you can't bring a microgrid together across a street, at least traditionally, without it being a violation of the utility's right to distribute power. So we in Connecticut have had to refine franchise rights. And I think that all of that creates this sense of risk and uncertainty and makes those that might otherwise want to finance a microgrid nervous that they're going to come up against a set of status quo, either laws or practices, that are going to make it difficult for that project to succeed. So I think there's and by the way, it's something could be as simple as the structure of a renewable energy contract. We're in New England now doing lots of contracting for renewable power. The structure of those contracts have lots of provisions about who bears what risks. And if utilities write those contracts so that they bear no risks, then the risks being borne by the project developers are very high. So we've got to understand that we need a new set of standard operating procedures, kind of groundwork on which to build so that these projects can go forward and that the financing can be seen as not so uncertain, not so risky, and therefore not so expensive.
And I want to encourage you to talk to
each
each other too, because that's more interesting. But go ahead, Richard.
Well, we agree, so it's the problem. I'm waiting for a disagreement. So I think the few things. One is that renewable energy is all about upfront costs, and that's one of the things that's different about other kinds of sources of power. And so all that upfront cost means that the cost of because the ongoing costs are close to zero, which means that capital costs are a much bigger impact. That's one thing. Second thing is that there is this issue on capital rules about small versus large projects. So large projects can get plenty of capital, but small projects can't. And when I talk about small projects, this would be true if you're talking about trying to raise $5,000 or $10,000 for some conventional energy project. I mean, it's not. It's because the projects can be very small. Talk about a residential energy efficiency project. That's a few $1,000s. A solar project, a residential solar project, is not many thousands of dollars. So small can be really quite small. We do not. There's been a recent solar lease securitization, but that is a very rare exception to the rule. And when you consider that we securitize credit cards and all kinds of stuff, we have not evolved to that yet. And one of the reasons is because we still use project financing. Dan talks about standardized contracts and all this. At the root of being able to reason why it's important to standardize contracts is that that's the royal road, as it were, towards securitization. It's not only about lowering costs, but you cannot securitize something if every project is a little bit different. And that's so if we've taken project finance, which was designed for huge projects, and tried to use the same kind of structure for things that are very small. And it's good for lawyers. I'm sorry for lawyers in the room, but it's bad for the cost of financing. And the other point I'd say is that the reliance upon tax equity. We support renewable energy in the form of tax credits. It's extremely difficult for small projects to get tax equity as well, and it also really impedes the creation of certain kinds of capital markets instruments because the tax equity gets the first dough off the top of the projects. And I don't want to go on about that. And the last thing on the capital markets is that there are people that really are interested in doing on Wall Street. There are people really interested in doing securitization of one thing or another, but you got to get a rating on something. So we'll talk about residential energy efficiency loans. Let's say we could standardize all the contracts and we could collect a bundle of residential energy efficiency loans. You go to the rating agency and say, okay, well, what is about the performance of these loans? Is the equipment? How do we know the equipment's really going to last? How do we know that the energy savings are really going to be there? How do we know that the property is going to be worth any more? What about the borrower? The borrower, yeah, they're saving money for their energy, but maybe they're drinking more beer, right? With the savings. How do we know that they're actually more creditworthy? So it's the fact that there's still inadequate data or inadequate time that impedes and that's why there is a role for credit enhancement to help stimulate markets.
Yes,
Can I just jump in and say,
Please.
I think what we've got are a series of big obstacles to success and then a whole lot of small obstacles that still haven't been worked out. And let me just name a couple of the small ones that actually loom large in aggregate. It's very hard to get energy efficiency done in apartment buildings because the person that's going to benefit, who's in the apartment paying the bill, is not the one necessarily putting up the cost or paying for the project. And so you don't have landlords who want to pay for these projects for the benefit of their tenants. So you have an agent principal problem in apartment buildings. Likewise, one of the things that we did with our CPACE program, our Commercial Property Assessed Clean Energy, is to make sure the loan runs with the building. If the loan only is with the guy who's in the building now or owns the building now, you have a problem. People won't invest if they think they're going to turn a building over in 5 or 8 years and the loan is going to run 10 or 12. So there's little things about getting the alignment between interests and financing to work out that I think we're starting to get our arms around. But it's been, a decade or longer that these things have actually plagued the ability to get serious flows of capital into either renewables or energy efficiency.
Let me ask one other question, and then I'll listen to the answer sitting down and ask Travis to come up. We've had senior level federal policymakers here, state policymakers. Ron Binns was just here a week or two ago. It's hard to think of many people we could invite who know both of those things as well as you do. So I wanted to ask you about the federal-state relationship when it comes to dealing with energy. And you sort of hinted at this jokingly, Richard, about the different view you have of the federal government now. But can you, when I was I've only worked in federal government, and so there were a lot of energy priorities that were important to us, like increasing efficiencies, giving utilities the right incentive to encourage efficiency, and things where you felt frustrated because it wasn't a federal issue. These are primarily regulated at the state level. So can you talk about what things the federal government could be doing to make it easier for the states to succeed where it does have the authority? And don't just say, give us more money, because that's sort of the easy answer. But things aside from that, and at a higher level, what issues do you think are best handled at the federal level, and what issues are actually best handled at the state level? And other thoughts you have on sort of the federal-state relationship when it comes to energy?
Okay,
We're all scribbling furiously.
Yeah, I know.
There's so much to say.
It's amazing. You get back to university setting, all the anxieties come back. I'm going to be having that exam nightmare dream tonight. So, okay, I just have four things. All right. So, the first, come on. The first thing is I talked about FERC. I mean, I do think that would make a big difference in terms of a rethink and an engagement with states on wholesale markets. Again, this idea of a two-way market would be very, very helpful. The second thing is that, and we did spend time on this in Washington, is that in terms of the evolution towards capital markets, having a publicly traded vehicle now, there are these yield corps, C corps that have in the market, but MLPs or REITs really would be helpful. They'd be helpful because it would not only lower the cost of equity, but when we think about the incentives for creation of securitized debt markets, having an equity market would be very helpful because equity holders would have the incentive to have cheap cost of debt. And when you think about lowering soft costs really means trying to standardize every step along the way, particularly to aggregate small projects. Because the great thing about it, renewable energy, the more of it you make, the cheaper it becomes. So scale really matters. And so the equity holder, when Dan talked about the contracts and what market power does somebody have against a utility? Very little. But if there were pools of capital that are in the stock market, those would be big pools of capital, and if that would have market power in terms of being able to try to create more leverage in the whole system about how things could be standardized. And the last point on that is that one of the things that everybody in renewable energy will tell you is stop-start for government policy. And if you have stock trading on the New York Stock Exchange that are renewable energy companies, suddenly renewable energy becomes not just a cost, but an opportunity for people to make money. Right now, when government decides it's not going to renew the wind PTC, people in Congress say, well, we're just getting in the way of some companies. But if they start messing around with retail investors and voters, it's a different matter altogether. And tax equity, having tax equity be refundable, having tax benefits be refundable in cash as opposed to relying upon tax equity. And the last thing is that states, when we talk about credit enhancement, there's a very limited amount we can do. We don't have an unlimited guarantee. We can't give a AA credit to lower the cost of financing. The irony is that a renewable energy project can get very inexpensive government cost of debt. It just can't be a project done in the United States. So we support international projects, renewable energy projects. We should do the same thing in the United States, and we could do that yeah, but it would require a little support from Congress.
So only to add a little bit to Richard's list, and we could go on. I mean, this is a great topic for those that want to dig in deep. But, I think a lot of FERC rules need to be relooked at. The order that FERC calls renewable power in, it creates uncertainty and cost and burden, makes it very hard for projects to get up and running. The fact that efficiency investments don't count in the calculations that FERC and the ISOs that carry this out across the country don't count in calculating what the capacity of power generation that's needed. So we end up exacerbating the problem Richard talked about of overcapitalized structures that are only utilized at 50 or 55%. The fact that FERC pays a super high return on transmission incentivizes people to focus on transmission as the answer to every problem, as opposed to thinking about a more diverse portfolio of solutions to our electricity of the future model. And that's only a few of FERC's problems, so we'll stop there for the moment. The Federal Housing Authority. One of the things I'm most shocked at, given my service in the Obama campaign team and on the transition team, is that the Federal Housing Authority continues to make it impossible to do property-assessed clean energy in the residential marketplace. This is an embarrassment. We have a robust CPACE, commercial PACE program now up and running. In Connecticut, we have a backlog of projects now stretching to $100 million, banks lining up to put money into this, and we can't do the same thing on the residential side because of the refusal of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to allow any requirements or any liens ahead of their mortgages. I think there are issues, too, around DOE rules, around the ISO rules. There are a variety of unintended consequences that are a structure of how energy policy has been done for a long time that should be stepped up and reexamined as part of a commitment to making not only the financing of efficiency and renewable easier, but frankly, if the president wants to succeed on his climate change agenda, rather than leaning heavily on EPA to do regulations, he could pick 5 or 6 of these federal departments and tell them to recast their encrusted frameworks of regulation and guidelines to optimize performance on climate change, starting with FERC, FHA, DOE, but there are probably 6 other agencies that have impacts that could help us get to the clean energy future we're all talking about the president seems to so much desire.
Wow. So the best thing about the CGEP events is that I feel both important and totally extraneous at the same time. It's great to have 2 such experienced and thoughtful state-level regulators. And I want to kind of flip the question that Jason just asked around and assume that the cavalry's not coming. That the federal government is perhaps preoccupied with other things and they forget to write the memo. There are other levels of government at the state level that I think, if you look out at California, Arizona, about 14 other states right now that have active net metering debates on the distributed energy side. Many of these states are the victims of their own success. They've had, California in particular, has had wonderful policies around incentivizing efficiency, decoupling, and distributed generation. And now it is in a situation where it's actually got an open, almost open warfare between the utilities and the the distributed energy community playing out really in front of state regulators. APS has just put in a new tariff, although it wasn't high enough for one side and too high for the other side. Doesn't seem like there's a lot of quarter in the middle. The Northeast doesn't have this yet. It isn't actively kind of acrimonious. Is there something that can be done at the state regulatory level between now and when that might happen that could avoid the same problems that we're experiencing in those other jurisdictions now?
Go ahead.
So, there's a certain technical element to this that I don't know whether everyone in the audience gets. But let me just give a few seconds of background. So when you put a renewable energy project in, you are, in most cases now, allowed to net meter, which means when you're producing power, you can consume as much of it as you need. And if you produce more than you need, you can put it back on the grid and get paid for it. And when you draw power, because you need more power than you're producing, you can net those gives and takes from the grid against each other. And that's a very cost-effective thing for the renewable power project, but not so good for the utility because they are getting less and less in the way of customers across which to spread the fixed cost of the big grid that they manage. So this is now in states that have ramped up renewables, particularly Arizona, which has been in the news in the last month, and California. We're seeing utilities in high panic that the fundamental structure of their business model is now challenged. And the answer is that is true. And just to push back on the question, I think it's true in New York and New England as well. We are seeing utilities that are very, very nervous about the growth of renewables and about net metering, and particularly virtual net metering, which expands that net metering concept. And I think you are going to see growing pushback. But I would tell you, and I know Richard's thinking about this, we're thinking about it as well, the answer to that is not to have entrenched warfare. It's for the utilities to recast their business model. And they need to think about being paid differently. And I think Richard mentioned earlier, well, we have decoupling, so utilities are not disincentivized to do efficiency. But he then a few minutes later pulled that back a little bit by saying, well, they're not really incentivized either. So let's recast utilities and incentivize them to deliver energy services and not electricity. Because decoupling really is just the blunting of the disincentive, not the creation of an incentive. So I say we should remake the business model. They should be paid to keep the lights on, however they can do it. So they're incentivized to deliver those lights. Or as my friend Amory Lovins likes to say, the American public doesn't really care about refrigerators or hot water heaters. They care about cold beer and hot showers. So let's pay the utilities to deliver cold beer and hot showers and let them figure out what gets done between the time you pull open the refrigerator door. And I think that really is where the opportunity lies. And, we both, as, energy officials have lots of day-to-day problems. But I think one of the joys is to see an emerging conversation about these bigger questions. I believe, and I think Richard does as well, we have had a very static electricity structure of a society for 100 years. I predict we will have a very dramatically different one in the next 10 years, never mind the next 50 or 100 years.
So I think that the kind of good news about the Northeast is that we're not California, and more importantly, we're not Germany, because I think that there's been there's been a tremendous loss of equity value, of utilities, but there are operating issues and cost issues in Germany. So Germany is a cautionary tale to a great degree. So I think that there are a number of points that I'd make, but I think I'd put them all under the heading of some of the issues associated with rate design, because it's not just about net metering. I mean, we don't charge residential customers time of use pricing. So it, in fact, costs different amounts of money to produce electricity at different times of the day, which depends on, demand. But customers are protected from that. All right? So what are we going to do about that? If you want to have a market work, in theory, you need to have price signals, but we don't have that. So I'm not advocating time of use price. I'm just pointing that out as a rate design issue. You pay the same if you're at the end of the line. You pay the same for your electricity, if you're next to the power plant, and so that's just the way we expect it to be. It's sort of as a right. I don't know if that's right or wrong, but the issue of it comes to a fore when we think about solar, because there are some cases where solar clearly helps the grid and is a net benefit to all customers, and then there are places where having solar is going to cost the grid and therefore cost other customers. So, but we give common incentives across, and so that's a rate design issue. Should we have the equivalent of just we still have a number of things that are volumetrically determined? Well, that really doesn't make any sense. Con Ed charges a delivery charge. They're not incented for I'm sorry. We should. I don't want to get into all that detail. Should we have the equivalent of just a base rate for the equivalent of a dial tone? So there are all kinds of questions that are raised by rate design, and these are very difficult and complicated issues, less maybe economically, but more politically.
We're going to open it up to questions, but let me just ask one last thing, because it's something that I worry a lot about in terms of, I know if I were to write a textbook about the best policy mechanisms that could be deployed to incentivize these technologies and the building of these markets, I would more or less take the work that you guys have done without much editing and present it, because I think that it's been fabulous. But I still worry, and maybe you can, I know you probably thought about this, and I just love to hear your response. I still worry about the issue of engagement with the consumer and making sure that there aren't too many programs, that each of them is not too small. There's a cost required or even a risk of having, and we've seen this in sort of energy efficiency and things. I'm not sure I want somebody from the state coming and looking at inside my house. There's any number of issues that come up, most of which have to do with the initial engagement. Some have to do with risk. But in terms of program uptake, in terms of the efficiency of the rollout of these programs you've designed, how are you helping to optimize that?
Well, you heard me say that in my vision of where innovation is required, customer engagement and marketing is one of the core areas. And Richard nicely mentioned our Solarize program, which I think is a good example of a changed approach to how you get the customer involved in and excited about, in this case, the opportunity of renewable power in the form of a rooftop solar array. And I think what you do in that regard is to get people comfortable with change because their neighbor has already adopted the change. And I think that's a very powerful comfort for people to see that the neighbor across the street or down the street has done something, and to know that it can't be that wild and crazy. So I do think standardization and making these things seem less new, difficult, hard to figure out. And I think to the point that you're suggesting, which is an important one, there shouldn't be 11 different financing programs. One of the reasons that competition doesn't work, as Richard was hinting at the end of his opening remarks, in having people choose an electricity supplier, is because there are 30 different plans and people don't know how to sort this out. So I think we do need some degree of structure and standardization to make the market work, and some education. Because all of us have learned, 15 years ago, or maybe it's 20 now, you called up, if you wanted a phone, you called up AT&T, and you got a phone for $29 a month. Now we all know whether to ask for a 1-year or a 2-year cell phone plan. We know whether we ask for 400 minutes or 1,000 minutes. But we don't have that same knowledge base in electricity. People don't know whether they should ask for a contract for 6 months or for a year. They don't know whether they should ask for time of use pricing, because that would actually help them or not. And so I think we have a significant consumer engagement / education element that needs to be developed if we're going to go in some of the directions that both New York and Connecticut would like to go.
I think you've heard me tell the story before, but the sign in the bathroom saying "hang up your towel, save the planet" is not the effective sign, right? It's 75% of the people that stayed in this hotel hung up their towel. That's the effective sign. So the tribe is a more important motivator than saving the planet. And so I think we're really at the very early stages of this question about customer engagement. The fact that we call that when government's going to come into your house and do an audit for energy efficiency, can we really be surprised that there isn't big uptake for that, right? And so, so the whole point about we've been assuming that if we get the financing structures in place, demand will follow, and actually financing follows demand, not the other way around. We've been selling energy efficiency on the basis of dollars and cents. We don't pay that much, really, for energy. So that's not going to be the motivator. So we have to find ways to, that's why this point about imagining a new energy future with new services that are really going to engage people is really meaningful. And I think this point about the community and community engagement, I'm not saying that's going to be the only answer, but it just feels like it's a very important part of the puzzle, because independence really matters. to a number of people. Communities want to have more control over things. The connection between energy, and Dan talked about this, and water and other resources. So the fact that it's a kind of homegrown electricity, can be connected to locavore. I'm not saying it's going to be a one-size-fits-all, but these things are all connected. So across New York State, in a number of communities that are trying to reinvent themselves because they need economic growth. The issue of people coming back into towns, even or smaller cities, and being able to walk, says that the energy system is tied into the transportation system. It's tied into they have to change their sewer, build new water, have new sewer systems. So they're digging up the street. They should think about broadband and think about other things that are going to be can help create this new energy system. So these are the kind of connections that we need to make.
Right. If you have questions, we'd love to take them at the microphone. If not, and I've got a couple here from.
If you could just state your name and affiliation, that'd be great.
Hello, I'm Chuck Samuel, and prior to having gone through the sustainability management program here, I spent 5 years working at the Dormitory Authority of the State of New York, where we, along with NYSERDA and NYPA and some of the utilities, worked pretty hard at trying to get things like on-bill financing and PACE far broader reach. Fairly unsuccessfully, I must say, and we weren't even trying to deal with Freddie and Fannie at the time. But a couple topics I'd like you to, if you would mind commenting on. One is the principle of community net metering as opposed to virtual net metering, which I think there's no bills even being written or on the floor right now for it, but is an interesting idea, I think. And the other would be for Dan, because you made me reach for my wallet for a second, because it sounded like you were almost suggesting a structured investment vehicle that contained really the worst attributes of those products, which is that nobody knows what's inside it. And in other words, complete opaqueness of what the credits are. And I don't know who's going to buy into something where nobody knows what what's standing behind them. So if I heard you wrong, please, I'd be happy.
I actually don't know what you're referring to.
It sounded like you're talking about a pool of debt, but you didn't know what was we're just going to kind of like put all these things together without analysis.
I don't think that was what I was
Well,
saying.
without knowing what the individual projects
Back
were. I
up
think.
2 sentences.
Okay.
What's the topic?
Pardon?
What was the topic that was under?
I think you were talking about just how to create a pool of money that could be used for financing projects. How to finance projects by putting them together and using the strength, it sounded like, of their credit as the way that either bonds would be issued or investors would buy into it or something like that.
Do you know?
I don't think that's what Dan was saying or that I was saying. I think that what we're talking about is the migration, the need to migrate financing of renewable energy and energy efficiency to capital markets. That's what we need to do, because that's how we mobilize trillions of dollars of capital. That's what we need to do, and that's the deepest pools of capital. And it's the only way we can deal with a systemic issue of bank risk. Banks have been in the business of disintermediating their balance sheets. I mean, of reducing their capital intensity, and by things that have long maturities, you want to have in the hands of bond investors. So it's easy. I think you're concerned about the mortgage finance business, and point taken. But I don't think anybody's talking about trying to create the mortgage finance business. I think what we're talking about is creating the credit card business that continues to be a very effective securitized. Lots of things are securitized very, very effectively and very safely. And so there is standardization actually creates a degree of transparency. It doesn't create inherently opacity.
If you'll give me just 1 second, we'd like to encourage our Twitter followers. There's a question of the potential pitfalls of having states act unilaterally versus in regional or larger blocks for reasons of safety, security, and persistence in the outcomes.
So I think we expect that there's a balance between states being able to run out in front and try new things. And, there's the famous principle of the laboratories of the states. And I think we agree that in Connecticut, at least, that there are some things we're trying that we hope others will find attractive. It's a great joy to have New York having set up a green bank. And one of the things that Richard and I say whenever we're together is that in this regard, it's by no means competitive. And quite to the contrary, if we're able to standardize the form across New York and Connecticut, then we have a broader base across which to securitize or to structure financing. So I think there is a good reason to want to do as many of these things on a basis that is regional, as a forerunner to going national, and that scale does matter. So doing things in bigger blocks rather than smaller is useful. But I would hate to preclude individual states from trying things, recognizing, by the way, that there are lots of things that won't work, and then no one is going to pick them up, and you won't have any followers. We've tried some things in our green bank that haven't worked. One of the things I have urged our green bank team is to continue to try new financing products, and then when things don't work, pull the money back and redeploy it in directions that are more promising. So I think the balance between individual initiatives state by state, some of which might get followed, and the desire, once best practices have been in effect identified, grouping together to go for scale is how to answer that.
I was just going to say, just quickly, to your point about we didn't get the memo, I am so excited about the ability for states to do stuff and not actually waiting for the federal government. It's a tremendous opportunity for states. And the point about Louis Brandeis, the states being a laboratory of democracy, is absolutely true. We're going to get so much more innovation. So yes, there's the cost of so many states doing certain things, and it might be better if we could do some things on a more collaborative basis. But the benefits of innovation that's taking place, policy innovation and speed, is more than offsets that cost.
Fair enough. Maybe we should send Germany a thank you letter for the mistakes that they made.
Absolutely.
So we've learned all of that.
It's a good example. So their model of feed-in tariff is now demonstrably not a best practice. And, I think we do owe all those that go out on the cutting edge a debt of thanks and a double debt to those that we actually end up following.
Hi, tell us your name and your question.
Thank you, gentlemen. Always a pleasure to come back to my alma mater, Columbia. My name is Pamela Peters. I'm an environmental economist specializing in sustainability, and I focus on accelerating the entry points for the green and social economy while empowering the consumer through media and consulting. It's the third time, and thank you so much, Richard, for again enlightening us today. It's the third time I have the pleasure to hear about his wisdom and what's happening here in New York. And I think it was the second time, it was the opening of the Climate Change Week, where I heard Mr. Kim, the director of the World Bank, for the first time actually make a very, very impressive remark saying, the number one problem right now we have to deal with is climate change. And I don't hear that enough. I don't hear enough about the costs. 65 billion, Superstorm Sandy, 159 people died, hundreds of thousands of homes got destroyed. So how about continuing to empower that consumer, which is pretty much one of your focal points, and I want to help you with that, right, through the media. And how about also using that leverage through the consumer, through the Green Bank, to motivate the federal level, to create some stronger legislation, because the bill to clean up is much higher than the price to invest, and that might assure the investor and the corporations to invest, to get some stability, to get some clear horizon, because we will need to embrace that cleaner future. How do you think we can do that to push? I know the federal is where you come from, but how can we push the federal a little bit more to create some urgency? Thank you.
So let me, because we've heard some really good language recently tying climate change to the investment community and the willingness to deploy assets. Is that effective, or where is climate change coming up in the debate or the effectiveness of deploying the programs you guys are talking about?
Was that a question for me?
No, that's
Okay.
I'm restating your question, perhaps.
So, first of all, I think the idea of empowering consumers makes a lot of sense. And I think some of what we've talked about today would do that. Both Richard and I would love to have the average citizen better able to understand their electricity generation choices and able then to factor in the opportunity to buy clean power, which almost every state now provides. It has deregulated markets. The second part of the question, though, I think I might draw a little line around. I'm not sitting around waiting for federal legislation to solve the climate change problem. Quite to the contrary, and I know Richard isn't either, which is why he's here and not in Washington, and why I'm in Connecticut and not in Washington. I think the answer to climate change will come from breakthroughs in the deployment of clean energy, and not because of a mandate from a treaty. Witness the lack of progress in Warsaw last couple of weeks. And not because it will come from mandates from the federal government. I think that's the 20th century model of command and control. And I'm much more excited about the decentralized and entrepreneurial and innovation-minded approaches that we've been talking about today.
So I was going to say, Pamela, I mean, I'm personally motivated by climate change. That's why I do what I do. But I'm not sure that, and in addition, I'm more optimistic than I've been in a very long time. But it's not because I think that there's more consensus about climate change. It's because the economics are changing. And so the economics, when we think about, as I said before, the cost of distributed solutions are changing. It is putting eventual pressure on the utility business model. The fact that the technology now enables us to have more system efficiency means that we can provide we can provide more value to consumers if we can create regulatory structures and economic incentives to adopt new technology. And that hasn't even talked about other value, these ancillary services that people could get using technology in their energy system. But when we talk about independence, that's just the tip of the iceberg. Comfort is a motivator. Health. If we can collect the data to say that the green buildings are healthier buildings and more productive buildings, we don't have to worry about, in a sense, the climate change as a motivator, getting companies to sign on. It's because they will rush because they'll reduce healthcare costs and have more productive employees. So, and the tremendous effort on data is going to be lowering customer acquisition costs. So there are so many other positive things that are going on that I think are going to, as I say, change the economics. On manufacturing, just one last point. When we talk about cost reduction, we haven't experienced, even though there have been dramatic declines in costs, we still haven't really gotten to a point of appliance scale or automotive scale kind of manufacturing costs. So there's another whole leg of cost declines in addition to all the soft cost declines that take place through scale. So there are so many things that are going to change the economics of the system, and as I say, it's kind of going to run past faster than climate. And I think individual motivations are also not necessarily driven by climate.
Thank you very much.
We may have time for one more. Please, your name and your question.
My name is Jeanette Barth. I'm an economist with the Pacton Institute, and I'm wondering if you are both aware of the study that was published in Energy Policy Journal earlier this year. It was written by Professor Mark Jacobson from Stanford University and others, and it shows that it is feasible for New York State to transition to 100% renewable energy in the form of wind, water, and solar for all purposes within a reasonable amount of time. And if you are aware of that, could you share your thoughts on it?
Yeah, let's
let's get a couple of questions in. That will be great, and then we'll try to answer a few right at the very end. Please.
My name is Marge Schaub. I'm with Damascus Citizens. Yesterday, the Mount Sinai Children's Environmental Health Center issued a whole new report on the effects the detrimental effects of our environment. We all agree we're in an environmental crisis, and a huge basis of that is our use of all fossil fuels. And they've calculated for New York that the cost, I'm quoting, the cost of diseases of environmental origin in the children of New York amount to about $4.35 billion each year. Now, that cost falls on the taxpayer and the families, and you're not addressing, which Paul Krugman calls the externalities of environmental economics. So I was wondering how will you address these costs that have to be paid for by families and by the regular people of New York due to the degradation of the environment? Thank you.
Let's do two last questions, and then we'll let them respond with their closing thoughts as answers.
David Gould, New York State resident. This question's for Mr. Kauffman. Even though we enjoy the progressiveness of a de facto fracking moratorium in New York, we're still dealing with its waste. As many of you may know, in central and western New York State, toxic brine from produced water is being spread on roads in those counties which haven't banned it, whereas counties like Orange and Westchester, et cetera, have banned it. I'm wondering, how does the spreading of frack waste on New York roads fit into the clean energy future?
Last one.
Hi, I'm Lloyd Cass. As Richard mentioned, I work for the state of New York, but I'm also here. I'm an adjunct here. So I'm in the educational side of this business, and everything that's been discussed is going to advance over a number of years, and that's going to be advanced by a workforce. And since we're here at a university, I personally am optimistic, about the emerging workforce to support all the activities you're describing. But I wondered, being here at Columbia University, what both of you gentlemen think about the what the educational sector can do to better prepare people for all the activities that you're describing.
Thanks.
Dan and I have discussed these questions, and he's going to give me more time to think about some of my answers, and he's going to answer the last one first, since he is, of course, Professor Esty at Yale University.
The deal is he gets the first three, I take the last one, but I go first. I think, in fact, that there is a need for a lot of innovation in the educational arena as well as these other areas we've discussed. I actually think many environment schools and business schools that teach about the environment and sustainability programs are quite stale. And my core thesis of the day, as I hope is now plainly evident, is that we need 21st century approaches to 21st century problems. So I am actually very unhappy about the state of sustainability education. I think, and I'll pick on Yale, we've had an environment school for 110 years. It was a forestry school for the first 70 of those years, and then emerged into a school of forestry and environmental studies. But there is still too much legacy in my mind on green issues as opposed to brown. So a lot of focus on land and conservation, less on pollution and climate change. There's still a lot of focus on rural plants and animals and preservation, less emphasis on urban. There's still a great deal of emphasis on government as the critical decision maker rather than business as the most important point of leverage. A great deal of focus on command and control rather than economic incentives, information technology, dissemination of best practices, engagement of the public. So I think there is a series of places and ways where our education and our curriculum needs to catch up with the kind of conversation we were having today in order to ensure that we're training people that are up to the problem solving that's required. Is that a long enough filibuster?
That's good.
I could go
You're
on.
Good. You're good. All right, just quickly try to address some of the other questions were asked. On fracking, as you know, the governor has asked the Commissioner of Public Health to do a complete study of fracking, and that's where things stand right now. What I did want to say, though, about gas generally, because Dan picked up this earlier, which really made the point about the need about price signals and markets, because as Jason's pointed out, that the natural gas is a game changer, and what it is going to do or is doing is to lead generally to a more emphasis on natural gas in the electricity system. And so we just need to think about that issue from a economic standpoint, and to be sure that when we talk about price signals, when you think about renewable energy, you know exactly what it's going to cost for its life. And we don't know, and historically natural gas has a lot of price volatility. So that's a factor that we need to think about when we think about the structure of wholesale markets. The other point I wanted to make about natural gas is that while it has had an effect on central station generation, it is increasingly having an effect on distributed generation. And that's, so fuel cells you can obviously deploy locally, but all other kinds of combined heat and power use natural gas. And there's a lot of venture capital money going in, and even some corporate money, going into devices that you could have in your house to produce electricity. And so that is that's kind of almost an existential threat to the utility business model. And so these are when I talked before about uncertainty and technology uncertainty, that's an example of really dramatic transformative change to the sector. The point about Jacobson's study, I mean, I think I said this before, is that the problem that we have in transition to a clean energy system is not technology. And so this is one of the things that when I was in Washington, I used to kind of run my head against some of my colleagues where they kept talking about we need to have more R&D. I absolutely could have more R&D, but we got to deploy what we've got and take advantage of scale economies that can come from deployment. And so the issues relate to market signals and regulatory incentives or disincentives, and the need to figure out how we can animate markets, because that's what creates scale, which is going to lead to lower costs. And so it's not a the engineering problems, as it were, or technology problems are there are some, of course, but they're secondary. And the point about externalities, I mean, I tried to address that. I mean, we know that markets are not always very good at pricing externalities. I mean, that's true. And so you have climate change, you have health issues, no question about that. And the only point that I was trying to make is that in spite of that externalities are not priced in spite of the fact that you have historically unlevel playing fields in terms of differential subsidies for fossil fuels versus renewables, in spite of all those things, we're at a point where I think you can feel very optimistic about some changes that can take place as a combination of technology and scale advantages and regulatory innovation and state, not just regulatory, but state policy innovation that can really have a major effect in making a transition. So it would be great if we could have a price of carbon. It would be great if we could price externalities, but we can make tremendous progress even without those things.
I wonder when optimism entered the room. I thought we were supposed to be so distraught and upset, but I guess you guys are seeing real progress on the ground. I hope you'll all join me in thanking you guys for the work and leadership that you've shown.
I forgot you and I both are optimists.